Welcome to this episode of Season 4 of The Common Bridge, where policy and current events are discussed in a fiercely nonpartisan manner. The host, Richard Helppie, is a philanthropist, entrepreneur, and political analyst who has reached over 3.5 million listeners, viewers, and readers around the world. The Common Bridge is available on the Substack website and the Substack app. Just search for The Common Bridge. You can find the program on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. The Common Bridge draws guests and audiences from across the political spectrum, and we invite you to become a free or paid subscriber on your favorite medium.
Yeah, look, the Republicans, if they had any brains, would find a way to show Trump the door. Okay, and I've been saying that for years. The last two presidential cycles been a lesser of evils, and we haven't got we haven't got any really good choices. Okay, in my humble opinion, in the last two cycles, and I was just curious as to why that tilt would go there, because the object of the game is not only the election, but it's what people do after they get there. So when I hear that, a Democrat or a Republican won, but gosh, they sure appealed to the other side. And then they go to Washington. And you know who's in Washington? It's, Kevin McCarthy, and it's Nancy Pelosi, it's Charles Schumer, and it's Mitch McConnell. And they're controlling committee assignments, they're controlling campaign funds, and they're making sure they get that vote out. That tension on, for Mary Patola, when she gets to Washington, that pressure on her to vote with the party, although it may be against her more, conservative or libertarian electorate. That to me is where we begin to get real democracy back, where we're not so concerned about the outcome of the election based on what badge the election's over, now go represent us. And, when I think about presidential politics, if you go back to the 1960 election, we had two people, either was qualified to be president of the United States. And it was a very close election, and they both had respect for each other. And there's a great deal written about how they handled that. Now, neither one of them, neither Nixon nor John Kennedy, could be nominated by their own party today. Okay, Nixon was far too liberal with the Environmental Protection Agency, with healthcare reform and such. And of course, Kennedy was also a defense hawk and a tax cutter. I mean, we've gone from that time to this really extreme polarization, and it's filtered down, and that's, my concern was what forms of voting reform can help us get to the point where we can hold those that we elect accountable to us again.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question, and core to, I think, the why we think actually ranked choice voting will ultimately grow to be used in all of our elections. Just to speak to that point about being just sort of a rubber stamp Democrat or Republican after being elected, if Peltola acts that way in Alaska, she won't last very long, right? It is a Republican-leaning state, or at least a conservative state, sort of a better way to think of it.
Exactly, I would agree.
And similarly, Jared Golden, the Democrat who won in northern Maine, it's kind of a somewhat similar. Mm-hmm. And he has now served. He's finishing his fourth year. He's in another close election with the same, actually two people from 2018. Interestingly, that Bruce Pollock was running again, but he has been kind of among the most conservative Democrats in his voting record, but not on everything, right? He sort of picks his battles, picks his issues. And I think, but because you're breaking down the binary, right? Because there's sort of this openness of choice, it allows politics to breathe more, right? It just allows more candidates to be part of the mix, voters to think outside of just single choiceness. And I think, getting to your point, it creates the space for different kinds of candidates and for voters to think about them, and not to be just so kind of dug in for one versus the other, and you just get to vote for one, right? So I think that's the promise of ranked choice voting. It can break us out of sort of a duopoly or this two-person kind of situation, and create these incentives for candidates to do something different, which speaks to why Peltola, it was so interesting that she can get that many Republicans to rank her second, why Jared Golden got such a big percentage of independents to rank him second. And Republicans can do that too, right? It's not like Democrats are the only people that can find ways to connect with people. And that's what we've seen in primaries, right? So when Glenn Youngkin, just to make a point about Republicans, Glenn Youngkin is now a pretty clear star of the party. He's not he's pretty conservative, but at the same point, he wasn't the most conservative candidate running in that primary. He was a relatively new figure in Virginia politics. People felt if it had been just a single choice election, he might have sort of fallen to like expectation games, like, well, he's not likely to win, so I won't even vote for him. And so, ranked choice voting is kind of very liberating, just to vote for whom you want. But when that contest happened, and 5 candidates got eliminated one by one, everyone could see that actually he was positioning himself well to be a second or third choice or fourth choice or whatever it would be of backers of every other candidate, right? So he showed that he was like this Big Ten candidate, so that he came out of the primary with a clear majority and a clear ability, where no candidate got more than about 30% in the first round, but he was able to build a majority, make this connection. And a lot of Virginia Republicans feel that was really key to them winning for the first time in a decade in any statewide election. And then they decided to use it for 3 congressional primaries this year by their own choice, right?
So absent that kind of ranked choice voting, the incentive is to run to the extreme, and the outsized influence of Donald Trump, which still boggles my mind, that it makes that encouragement is to run to that extreme, because that's where the biggest pile of voters are, versus being who you are and saying, you're effectively applying for a job. And kind of what I'm inferring in here, Rob, is that the opportunity for more parties gets stronger, because you're not, if someone is voting for someone other than a Republican or a Democrat, if they're voting for an independent or one of the other parties, they're not really letting their vote act as a spoiler. They're expressing their real view, so they might, as you were talking about in Maine, independent may be the first choice, but second choice may be a Democrat, maybe a Republican. And throughout history, we've had spoilers that are affected. So here's the thing I'm trying to work out is, if the object of the game is to avoid the extremism and to get people with broad appeal, and I said, all right, so I'll go back to the 1992 presidential election. Okay. Bill Clinton won that election with 43% of the vote. And when you break down the votes, like California, Ross Perot got 20% of the vote. He got almost 16% in New York. And I think, well, what would have, it's speculation where Perot's voters would have gone for choice 2. But it's such a significant part. And I can tell you this as a personal level. I was standing in line to vote for the president in 1992. And I would have said, I thought Perot would probably do a better job. It's a lot of the things we're dealing with the deficit and things today. He was central to his platform. But I ended up not doing it because I just thought, well, my vote's not going to count.
You don't want to throw your vote away. Right. Yeah. And that's the expectation game that really makes it hard for independents and third parties. It's sort of like they're really in a bind, because either that happens and they don't get many votes, or they get, a relatively substantial number of votes like Perot ultimately did. And then people say, you're a spoiler and you're terrible. Right. And so it is, we keep having that debate and conversation. In fact, that was the first year for fair vote. Right. And so.
Oh, that's right. Okay. Yeah.
If you go back further in time, John Anderson had run for president in 1980.
Yep.
And he had been an independent. He actually had been polling in the 20s. And then, as an independent, he's a Republican who had served 20 years in Congress, but he was of the more moderate liberal wing of the party. And when Ronald Reagan was becoming the nominee, he wanted to put his name forward to sort of hold on to his vision of what the party should be. And he had a lot of support, but then ultimately he was in that position of like people didn't think he was going to be viable, and he only got like 7%. Anyway, John was actually our founding advisory chair, national advisory chair, and he had an op-ed in the New York Times in the first month of Fair Vote, making the case for ranked choice voting in the context of that election. And so it's always made sense, by the way. It's, and it's not the only thing that we've worked on, but it's something that we've consistently worked on. And it's been exciting to see such progress, but we have to get out of that cycle, right? It's like,
I agree.
They're already talking about for 2024. Oh, it might be Biden versus Trump.
No,
gosh, if it is, then we have to have somebody else. But then it's going to be a third party, and then it's going to be a split vote, and it's like wringing their hands. And it's like, you know what, guys? There is a solution, right? Well, and don't just wring your hands. Do something about it.
What I'm trying to do is get to the solution. I remember John Anderson in the debates in 1980, and he was really good. Okay, they had a question about nuclear weapons, and I forget what Reagan said, and Jimmy Carter talked about Amy. Anderson steps in and he says, "Well, I don't know about this, and I can't speak for little Amy, but they came out with something very smart." So it was good man, service. And you mentioned the liberal wing of the Republican Party, which it doesn't exist anymore. The conservative Democrat is all but a extinct species. And so, but I'm trying to say, right, in 92, I don't think anybody would think Bill Clinton is an extremist. I mean, he ran as a centrist, as a third party, but in all likelihood, he under ranked choice voting would have lost, given what likely would have happened with Perot's voters. But there's another case in history where we elected a president with 39.8% of the vote. Okay. And I think, do you know who that president is?
That was Abraham Lincoln.
Exactly. Who was seen, by the way, as an extremist of his time.
Right. Though before we leave Lincoln, but make your point, but I do want to make sure that we talk about his nomination as well. Yeah,
right. Exactly right. So my point is this, that my view.
Right. And so that I'll just make that point. In the nomination, he was down by 20 points at the convention in the first round. He was in second. A guy named Sword, who ultimately became, I guess, head of one of his cabinet secretaries. But that Lincoln was the one that kind of built a consensus within the party. He was like sort of the second choice candidate of backers of others. So it ultimately became the nominee. So he was actually a beneficiary of ranked choice voting in the nomination. It was like a round by round ish, like ranked choice voting, right? They just voted repeatedly, which you can do in an in-person convention. And I'll say parenthetically, ranked choice voting is widely used in governmental elections, or rather in private, like non-government elections, like party primaries and then organizational contests, because of that feature. It's like round by round voting. It's just a more efficient way of doing it. And anyway, in the general, it's a very complicated election for 1860. But I will say he actually won more than 50% of the vote in states that would have allowed him to become president under the electoral college system. He just didn't even run in the South. Showed how polarized things were. He didn't even try to get any votes.
Yeah, and think about our last presidential elections. The last two, there were states that were just basically conceded to the other party. It's like, why bother?
That's the great majority of congressional races are conceded, and at this point, about 40. Maybe 38 states are just conceded from the get-go.
Yeah, exactly right. And I think we all know that means that we have an unresponsive government. And, look, we have solvable problems. I wrote a column this past week about healthcare, and the solutions are right in front of us. I've written about firearms and written about immigration policy and such. These are all solvable problems, but not if we can't even agree on what the issue is. And people are going to have, quote, their own set of facts. Rob, this is a great topic, and it's really an honor to be talking to you about this. Some of the advocates, here's what I'm kind of taken away from this, that pro ranked choice voting, you can vote for your favorite candidate, even if you don't think that person is going to win. So that dilemma of, I really like candidate A, but I don't think they have a chance. I'm in effect voting for my second choice, because strategically I think they'll win, instead of saying this is my choice, and if I can't have them, this is choice 2, choice 3, choice 4. And that I see where perhaps I'm an optimist that a measure of civility can come back into play. That
Absolutely,
I
think
can't be
that's
so extreme.
yeah. I
And
mean, it's not like everyone will love everyone else, but here's the thing: is that what we see, and even the examples that we talked about in some detail, like the Alaska race and the Maine race, is that candidates who did a better job at connecting with the backers of another candidate were rewarded for that.
Indeed, and again, that's civility versus people being rewarded for partisanship. And I obviously spend a lot of time reading and about policy and about politics, and actually assessing as much media as I can get my hands on. And some of them, I'm wondering, like, who are the people that elected this and put that in office and continue to return them? And it's because people can get in. Other things that I heard are positive, that the runoff requirements are eliminated, because there's in effect a pre-cooked runoff with the voter turnout already set. I don't know this. How prevalent are runoffs? Is that eliminating runoffs, is that a big thing, or is that just kind of a little icing on the cake for the people that are in favor?
It's a very big thing for local elections. It's actually pretty common to have either a traditional runoff or like a primary, like a nonpartisan primary where only two people advance.
Mm-hmm.
So a whole lot of the uses of ranked choice voting are taking these 2-round systems and folding it to one. Probably of the cities that use ranked choice voting, and we're up to more than 50. I would say some version of 40 of them folded 2 elections into one. In our federal elections, we used to use runoffs more often, but runoffs are complex for us, right? They cost money. They add burdens to voters and candidates. They, of course, make it a lot more expensive to run. You've got to run again. That Georgia runoff back in 2020 for Senate, the estimates are about $1 billion was spent in that runoff alone, just on the candidates. So that's a lot of money. And if you just get it done in one round, that doesn't happen. But so we see a handful of states using it, not many, like Georgia. Several more use it in their primaries. And that's, there's a really clear efficiency argument. We actually looked at the last 250 congressional runoffs for primaries, and that's used in, I think we're about 8 states that do that these days. And the average drop in turnout was about 40%. So about, almost, that's a big decline in turnout, and it costs money and everything. So ranked choice voting is a faster, cheaper way to handle that.
Yeah, indeed. And I'm curious of what the outcome would have been in Georgia had they had the runoff. Had not had the runoff and had ranked choice voting, because to your point, there's $1 billion spent and a lot more people saying things, and who knows what voters did. I'm sure some just rejected some of the candidates. Here's what some of the critics of ranked choice voting say, that it splits the coalitions that political parties work to organize. And they're using examples like Sanders and Biden, and how the president has to appeal to that far left wing. And I thought about, coming up, a Mike Pence versus, like a Mitt Romney. I mean, Mitt Romney's been a centrist his entire life. Pence has been more of a strong conservative, particularly on social values. Is there any validity to that the parties organizing coalitions are somehow weakened? I didn't quite get the link, but I'm just telling you what I'm looking up.
It's very contextually made. I mean, I think that say that system we've been talking about in Alaska, where you can have 2 people of the same party running at the same time, that theoretically can kind of split a party into 2. It does mean they have to work to really, they have someone who articulates the case, and then the other side has to make sure they try to hold them as second choices and look for common ground. I think if we think about independents and third parties, they already exist right? It's just a way of recognizing their existence and having that be built into our politics. So I think actually, rather than saying it's sort of somehow fracturing us, it's kind of creating an opportunity for those voices to be heard, their voters to be expressive, and the major parties have an incentive to incorporate that perspective in. The longest standing place that's used ranked choice voting is Australia. And they generally, the major two parties there win the great majority of seats, but they really have to work hard to be the second and third choice of any third party and independent. And they need to kind of keep bringing that energy in and adapting it to themselves. So it's kind of incorporating perspectives. And I think that's the classic good coalition building.
Great. And another term that I've read, and it's a criticism, is something called an exhausted vote. Is there a common definition for this, and what's the issue?
There's some weird terminology in our field, I must say. That's a weird one. We actually just call those inactive votes, but it's out there as an exhausted vote. That's a person who just didn't rank any of the active candidates. So when we talked about Alaska, and about 20% of the Begich voters, when he was eliminated, didn't rank either Peltola or Palin, their ballots became exhausted. We would call inactive. But it does mean that it's not a mandatory rank system, right? So you don't have to rank, but that in turn means certain people don't rank, and then their ballots become inactive. I mean, some would call it a so our critics on that one, if we were requiring people to rank, I'm sure we would get a lot of criticism. By not requiring to rank, we're now getting some criticism that some people don't rank, but it's just up. It's up to the voter.
Yeah, exactly right. And that was the other criticism, is that people might leave the voting place without understanding how to do that. And that's why I asked a question about what your group, Fair Vote, is doing in terms of educating and processes and things. And it's and I do understand your point about if a person is a very pro a particular candidate or party, and they've made that as their primary choice for whatever reason they choose to make it, but they might want to learn what those alternatives are. And because of that inactive or exhausted ballot status, they do want to make a second, a third, and a fourth choice. And that it would be foolish to not do that in case your first choice didn't go in. So I can see the benefits from there. Rob, are there any actions that you'd recommend that people take today? I mean, you've been at this for a really long time, since the end of the first Bush administration, beginning of the Clinton administration. When you've seen a lot, you've obviously been on a lot of big name networks, and now, of course, being on the Common Bridge is pretty much the pinnacle. So
I've reached the peak. Yeah,
indeed. So if you were, to talk to our listeners, our viewers, and our readers, and said, look, here's something you can do today, what would you advise them to do?
Well, it's something we have seen over and over again. I've worked on this for 30 years, and almost all the progress that has happened, and it's a lot of progress has happened just this year alone. Bills in 30 state legislatures, more than 30 states, 6 states legislatures passed some pro ranked choice voting bill. We've had a number of we have 9 city and county ballot measures this November, all of which were put on the ballot by a charter commission or by the city council itself. Almost all those efforts started with some person in that community, some person in that state getting interested and talking to people or getting onto a charter commission and, making it happen. And it's something that we have seen. Our system is sprawling, and we have a huge number of elections and things, but it's actually kind of porous as far as an opportunity to make a difference if you decide to. And the thing that I find with ranked choice voting, there's a whole gamut of ways that it can speak to issues that some community may be having with their elections, like the runoff election or some controversial race where 6 people ran for mayor and someone won with 23%. You see these kinds of things and people say, gosh, I wish there was something better. And if you're an activist in that community, or you can connect with the local group, we now have state groups in more than 40 states. So if you go to fairvote.org and get involved, or actually Fairvote Action is a branch of Fairvote. There are other allies. There's a group called Rank the Vote, which is specifically focused on helping state groups be effective. They can often get something going, and that's exciting. You can actually use it on college campuses. For instance, we're up to about 100 colleges and universities where student leaders have adopted it for their student elections. Young people, by the way, overwhelmingly like ranked choice voting. Even it's one on the ballot almost everywhere it's been on the ballot. One place that it didn't win in the last few years was Massachusetts, but 80% of people under 30 voted yes. And I think it's like we're going to get to ranked choice voting. It's a matter of how quickly, I think. But I think that you can use it in your organization elections and so on. And there's tools to do that now. There's a lot of online tools. And speaking of online tools, we have a thing called Rankit.vote. There's other tools like that where people can just set up a contest for their friends and say, hey, let's vote on something, and just here's kind of a Rankit tool. So fundamentally, we like the idea of reimagining voting as ranking, that's actually a better way to vote. And we've seen that happen in other countries, that like Australia and Ireland, for instance, everyone ranks instead of votes, essentially, and for everything. And so I think that's actually a healthy direction for us, and something that people can really do. They can do it, or they can get involved in trying to get it done.
Great. Rob, this has really been a great education. And before we wrap up here, I want to ask one thing about the number of political parties, excuse me. I know there's a lot of frustration with the two major parties, and I know that they've embedded themselves into our current process in ways that's very difficult to get out. But it just seems to me that with a ranked choice system, there might be opportunities for other parties to come to the fore. Am I wrong about that?
Absolutely. I mean, here's the way they clearly can from the get-go, which is that the spoiler argument against a third party goes away, right? So they can participate on an equal basis and be considered for their merits rather than for the calculations of whether they're a spoiler or not, right? So it allows them at least to get into debates. Like the whole calculation to keep them out of debates is really like, oh, they're going to spoil the election and so on, right? So it kind of opens up politics that way. And I think there's a lot of hunger for third parties. I will say, we didn't get into this much, but there's an application of ranked choice voting that speaks to this even more than what we've talked about, which is that congressional elections by statute, and actually local and state elections can do this too often, can go from a winner-take-all system where 50% of the vote is necessary to win, or the most votes, to some kind of American form of proportional voting where almost everyone ultimately gets to help elect someone. So it goes from as many as 49% of people not being able to help elect someone to maybe that number dropping to only 15 or 20, and like 80% of people get to help elect someone, and they can be different candidates. So it's where people are electing more than one candidate at a time, and then you can have 25% elect this person, 25% that one, and 25% the third person, and you ultimately have 3 representatives. That's called the Fair Representation Act in Congress. It's a bill that a number of members have put forward, and it really creates space for third parties to actually have a better chance to win, but certainly to be impactful, and for the major parties to be more of their big tent to be represented together, and the major parties to actually represent the same area together. So you would have like New York City Republicans, Panhandle Democrats of Texas, and so on actually represented, and then working together because they're all representing the same people. That is a system that can be done by statute. It's not in the Constitution that we can't do that. And that would, I think, even go further than what we talked today to kind of create a politics promotes unity, really promotes sort of unity out of difference, and e pluribus sort of unum kind of concept, out of many one, that we allow the many to be heard, to be more of them represented, and then ultimately they have some incentives to get things done together. And that's something that we think will actually go furthest in kind of getting to the root of our polarization. It's the next step. it's the next conversation to have. Right now, ranked choice voting is ready to win, and we are excited by that. But the conversation we ultimately want to see is about how we might change winner take all itself.
Yeah, that's a topic that we've covered, and I'll be getting other guests on this show with other views as well. But universally, people want to get off the extremes, the rancor, the partisanship, and I think the term you used is unity. Our current president ran hard on that as a theme, and I do think there's a great desire because in my travels throughout the country, which are extensive and at all socioeconomic levels for a very long period of time, the United States of America is filled with very compassionate and very generous people and very capable people. And then when you look at what's happening in our political system, it's just not as good as the people are. And we need to get out of this system where the winner is the one that can tear down the other one, get a plurality, and then run amok until they're tossed out in 2 years or 4 years. And potentially, if we get reasonable people that are willing to enter the fray, because there's an opportunity that they're not going to go into a process that just doesn't pick the best people.
Yeah, I think there's a reward that comes from this beyond what we've talked about. That's a direct reward for candidates for reaching out. I think it's the reward for all of us that it creates a way in for that kind of different kinds of candidates. And then if they see a lot of more people like that, it makes service that much more exciting, that you can work with other people that are trying to actually, speak their mind, but get things done at the same time. And I think that that's something that, we can't oversell our changes, but I think it is actually a very promising byproduct of going to these changes.
Great. Rob, before we wrap up here today, is there anything that we didn't talk about today that you'd like to cover?
Well, I think we ended up talking a little bit about, the ultimate way that ranked choice voting can be used in the multi-member districts on the ballot in Portland. I will say short term, I expect the quickest growth in our use of it in statewide elections will actually be in presidential primaries, which we talked about. But that's something we see. We expect several state legislatures will take that up next session. As they look to 2024, they still have time to get ranked choice voting into the 2024 presidential primaries. So that's exciting for us. And I just think that general ability to reimagine voting as ranking is a fun thing to go through. And just even as you just sort of look at politics as it is, kind of imagine what would it be like if I had a chance to actually rank these candidates, and how might I vote differently? And then you start realizing gosh, I really wish I could do that. Right. So anyway, we do look forward to engaging with your listeners. Super appreciative. You're doing these whole series of conversations with people, and glad to be part of it.
Well, thank you for being here. Any closing thoughts?
I think we've covered it.
Great. We've been talking today with Rob Richie of fairvote.org. Please look this up. This is of course, controversial topic, but that's what we do on the Common Bridge. We have good, polite discussions with experts, with people that are advocates from certain areas, and it's our opportunity to hear each other out and talk as Americans and as people around the world in our audience. So with my guest, Rob Richie, this is Rich Helppie, signing off on the Common Bridge.
Thanks for joining us on the Common Bridge. Subscribe to the Common Bridge on Substack.com or use their Substack app, where you can find more interviews, columns, videos, and nonpartisan discussions of the day. Just search for the Common Bridge. You can also find the Common Bridge on Mission Control Radio on your Radio Garden app.